This is the first lecture for Module 7, and in this module, we'll take a look at the emancipation of slaves during the Civil War. We'll look at the role of African American soldiers and sailors in the war. Following that, we'll take a look at Reconstruction, and we'll take this trend or these developments all the way up to the end of the 19th century. In this first module, we'll focus on the beginnings of the war and the emancipation of slaves. If we look at this map, we'll get an idea of, or we can get an idea of what happens in 1861 as the slaveholding states of the South, of the Deep South and the Upper South, secede from the Union and organize the Confederate States of America. Those states, the darkest colored states at the very bottom, from South Carolina all the way across to Texas, were the states that seceded before April 15th of 1861. The states that seceded after April 15th of 1861 are those in the lighter shades, from Arkansas across through Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. West Virginia was a section of Virginia that was opposed to secession and indeed seceded from the state of Virginia and came back into the Union in 1863 as a state, a slaveholding state, you might say, that remained in the Union, as did Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland. Now, there is one small error on this map. Tennessee was not number 10 to secede. It was actually number 11. It followed very closely behind North Carolina, but Tennessee was the last state to secede from the Union. As soon as secession was accomplished, and as soon as the fighting actually began in the Civil War, after the firing on Fort Sumter and the First Battle of Bull Run, African American men in the North moved immediately to volunteer to fight for the Union. African Americans viewed the war as an opportunity to end slavery, but they were rejected. Their volunteering was rejected. Black people understood the implications of the war for slavery even before the Union chose to admit it. For example, Frederick Douglass noted, "To fight against slaveholders without fighting against slavery is but a half-hearted business and paralyzes the hands engaged in it. Fire must be met with water. War for the destruction of liberty must be met with war for the destruction of slavery." A letter writer to the Anglo-African newspaper urged Northern black men to decline any request to serve in Union military forces until slaves were freed and black Northerners received treatment equal to that of white people. Black men in Philadelphia volunteered to infiltrate the South and incite riots. Black men in New York formed their own military companies and began to drill. In Boston, they drew up a resolution modeled on the Declaration of Independence, appealing for permission to go to war. However, the use of black troops was problematic, and most Union generals, as the Union as a whole, as the Northern Army and Northern government as a whole, really had no clear idea of what they would do with those African Americans who volunteered, how they would use them, or if they would use them at all. According to Abraham Lincoln, this was a war in which slavery was not the issue. The most important task was to preserve the Union. It was not the important task was not to favor the abolitionists, not to favor freed people, not to even consider the abolition of slavery. It was a war to preserve the Union. Lincoln was also cautious because he didn't want to offend the slave states that were still a part of the Union. Remember the map that we had earlier. Those states from Missouri, Kentucky, the western part of Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware that had not left the Union. The government policy, in effect, though, was that they had no real policy. especially in terms of African American slaves who were escaping from their owners and trying to reach Union lines. Many Northerners, Lincoln felt, would not support slavery, would not support an end to slavery, which put Union commanders in a difficult position, even with their own troops. Each commander eventually just simply used his own discretion. And the key issue here is what would be done to those slaves who are escaping from their owners, leaving the plantations, coming across Union lines. Would they be accepted? Would they be returned? What would be done to them or with them? George B. McClellan in Virginia, General George McClellan in Virginia, said to Virginia slaveholders, quote, "Not only will we abstain from all interferences with your slaves, but we will, with an iron hand, crush any attempt at insurrection on their part." On the other hand, Benjamin Butler, in May of 1861, General Butler had as his policy, when fugitive slaves came into his camp, he would declare them contraband of war and put them to work to support the Northern war effort. John C. Fremont in Missouri in 1861 had a similar notion. He confiscated slave property, slaves belonging to Confederates around him, and declared the slaves to be free. Lincoln, however, immediately reversed Fremont's order and actually removed John C. Fremont from his command. General Henry Halleck ordered escaped slaves in the Ohio Valley returned to their owners. General Winfield Scott in the Eastern Theater asked that Confederate slave owners be allowed to recover slaves who had crossed the Potomac River to what the slaves thought was freedom behind the Union lines. And General Ulysses S. Grant in Tennessee returned runaway slaves to their owners if the owners supported the Union cause. But those who did not, he put those slaves to work building fortifications. So you can see that there was some general confusion in terms of what would be done to slaves who were escaping from their owners during these early months of the Civil War. The confusion didn't last very long, however. By August of 1861, Congress had passed the first Confiscation Act, which said, in effect, that all property belonging to persons who were fighting against the Union would be declared to be the lawful subject of prize and capture, in other words, contraband, wherever it was found. And the law went on to say, quote, "It shall be the duty of the President of the United States to cause the same to be seized, confiscated, and condemned." Now, obviously, they're not going to condemn the slave property, but what this meant, in effect, was that the slave property, slaves who got to Union lines after this passage of the first Confiscation Act, would be allowed to remain behind the Union lines and to help build the fortifications, which was basically what generals like Ulysses S. Grant had been doing all along. In July of 1862, Congress passed the Second Confiscation Act. Now, by July of 1862, it was very clear that Lincoln was already moving toward a different policy in relation to slavery. Lincoln had initially appealed to the congressmen from the border states that had never left the Union to support the idea of gradual confiscated emancipation with colonization of freed slaves outside of the United States. However, the governors and congressmen in these border states were not willing to go along with this. On July 17th of 1862, Congress passed two very important acts, one of which was the Second Confiscation Act. This act freed slaves of persons who were assisting in the rebellion, those who were active Confederates assisting in the rebellion against the Union. It authorized the president to use persons of African descent to help suppress the rebellion. Congress also passed a Militia Act on the same day as they passed the Second Confiscation Act, and this provided for the employment of persons of African descent in any military or naval service for which they may be found competent, granting freedom to slaves who were employed in this way, and to their families if they belonged to disloyal owners. On July 22nd of 1862, Lincoln announced to his cabinet his intention to issue a proclamation freeing slaves in the rebel states, but he agreed to postpone this until after the Union had a suitable military victory. Now, one reason for this, obviously, is that in the Eastern Theater, things were not going well for the Union Army. By Eastern Theater, we mean those areas in which the fighting was taking place east of the Appalachian Mountains, around Virginia, the Northern Carolinas, North Carolina. So since this was probably the most visible of the war areas, Lincoln didn't feel comfortable issuing an Emancipation Proclamation as long as it seemed that the Union was losing the war. He felt that this would seem to be like an act of desperation. But things were going a little different direction from Lincoln's plans. What was actually happening, particularly in the South, was that slaves were pouring across Union lines. They were leaving the plantations, as you see in this photograph, escaping as their owners went away or whenever they could. But there was no policy for how the Union would handle these large numbers of slaves who were leaving plantations. In Tennessee and other parts of the South, special camps were set up in places like Grand Junction, and abandoned plantation lands were leased to whites who would then hire the former slaves to work on these plantations. And in theory, the profit from the plantations would be used to support the Union Army or the Union cause. The most important thing is that, however, is not so much what's going to be done with the profit from the plantations, but this whole idea of these slaves, in effect, bringing about their own emancipation, even before Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. One Missouri observer called this movement of slaves away from the plantation a Negro exodus. He said, quote, "Scores or hundreds of slaves, embracing not only families, but conveying away with them horses, wagons, and even the trumpery that pertains to their domestic establishments." He went on to say, "Like the children of Israel, they," meaning the slaves and their families, "are in many instances despoiling their masters and their mistresses by the wholesale appropriation of goods and chattels." In other words, what he thought was happening was that the slaves were not just leaving the plantations, but since the masters, the owners of the plantations and the slaveholders had left ahead of the Union Army, what this man or this observer thought was happening was that the slaves were taking much of the owner's property with them when they left. This observer also noted that the slaves were, quote, "silently and surreptitiously exercising their self-assumed rights to pass acts of self-emancipation." Self-emancipation, again, before the Emancipation Proclamation. He went on to say, "Thus in large streams and in little streams, the institution of slavery in Missouri is rushing and trickling out and spreading over free fields around us." Now remember, Missouri was one of those states, slaveholding states, that did not leave the Union. So this whole issue of what is happening in terms of emancipation is having a profound impact, not just in areas of the Confederate States of America, but also in the upper South parts of the upper slaveholding areas or the lower slaveholding areas of the Union. In the 1930s, when the United States government sent people out to collect the WPA slave narratives that were mentioned in your textbook, one woman, Mary Barber, who was 81 years old at the time that her narrative was collected, said the following, and she remembered this movement away from the plantation. She said, quote, "One of the first things that I remembers was my pappy waking me up in the middle of the night, dressing me in the dark, all the time telling me to keep quiet, quiet. One of the twins hollered some, and pappy put his hand over its mouth to keep it quiet." So this is her description of how they had to literally sneak away from the plantation. Now, once they got away from the plantations, and you see the roads, of course, are clogged with escaping slaves who are moving. And again, the Union has no plan for how to deal with this. It in some places created all kinds of problems in terms of the movement of the Union Army, because as you can see in this picture, on one side of the road you've got Union forces, the mounted leader of the forces, his military people behind him. But on the other side of the road, you've got slaves or former slaves trying to escape from the plantations, trying to escape from slavery. And what did they get to? Well, again, there is no official policy as to how you're going to handle this, because this was not a part of Lincoln's original war plans. And the abolitionists, of course, had fought for an end to slavery, but had no real plan as to what was to happen after that slavery had ended. Union Army officials and federal agencies were faced with the problem of what to do with these thousands of contraband, meaning the people who had escaped from the plantations, who were fleeing to their lines. They began to set up what were known as contraband camps. In fact, 2 camps were set up near Fort Pickering, the Union fort in Memphis, and another on President's Island in the Mississippi River near Memphis. Other camps, contraband camps, were established in Corinth, Mississippi, and Grand Junction, Tennessee. Women in these camps worked as cooks, laundresses, washerwomen for Union soldiers, or as searchers of white women who were passing across the Union lines. Now, I need to also add that Tennessee, of course, seceded from the Union in June of 1861, but Memphis falls to Union Army forces, naval forces, and the Union fort at Fort Pickering is established very soon, within a year. In fact, the Battle of Memphis, the naval Battle of Memphis, that occurred just below the bluffs, near, I guess, just below the bluffs, near what we could see now as Confederate Park. That Battle of Memphis actually took place in June of 1862. And then after the Union began building this fort, and you had the hundreds of slaves from western Tennessee, from Shelby County, from Fayette County, from Tipton County, from northern Mississippi, from parts of Missouri, southern Missouri, and Arkansas, as these slaves began to pour into the Union Army areas in and around Memphis, then the Union had to set up these camps in which to house the escaping or the freed slaves, escaping slaves who were declaring themselves to be free, I guess would be a better way of describing this. The men who came to these camps were drafted for work building roads and building fortifications, Union Army fortifications, and eventually they would be drafted out of the camps into the Union military. At one point, 3/4 of the inhabitants in the Memphis contraband camps were women. Conditions in the camps were poor. Housing could range from the tents as you see them here, and this is not a contraband camp around Memphis, but it is what one of them might have looked like. Housing was poor. Some camps had cabins, others had tents. They were often overcrowded. Disease was rampant. Northern aid societies like the American Missionary Association did send workers, however, to try to help organize these camps. They set up schools. They began to develop churches. And they also began to encourage slaves who were in the camps to legally marry. Remember, marriage was something that was not legal for slaves. So in the contraband camps, what the aid societies and eventually the Union Army are trying to encourage is for the freed people to legalize their relationships. Freed people eventually moved from the camps into city neighborhoods, and these same patterns of movement occurred in contraband camps in other parts of the South. Contraband camps in and around Memphis, like in Corinth, Mississippi, were eventually consolidated. And those people who were in camps in Memphis and in Corinth, Mississippi, and LaGrange were brought into Memphis. So Memphis became a major area for the in-migration of freed people, former slaves from the South during the Civil War. Now, the most important thing that happens as a result of the self-migration, self-emancipation of slaves is that Lincoln is forced into this position of having to do something about it. Other events are also forcing him into this position. But again, we have to go back and just kind of take a look at what I said early about Lincoln's position, that he was reluctant to move against slavery. He moves very slowly. In 1861, he says, this is not a war to end slavery. It's not a part of our objective. He's concerned about the border state loyalty. But within that year, what you see happening is slaves leaving the plantations in the border states, like Missouri. Lincoln had supported the idea of compensated emancipation and colonization. Border states did not accept this, his offers of this, so he just abandons that position. He had, as early as April of 1862, had even considered issuing some kind of an order or trying to move people toward ending slavery in these areas. But the key thing is that he can't do anything as president to end slavery. He can't ask Congress for a law to end slavery at this point because of the conditions, because this is a war. But he does plan to do something. And he is waiting, again, for that Union Army victory that will allow him to do it. The movement is very steady toward this. And in April of 1862, he declares slaves in the District of Columbia in Washington to be free with compensation to their owners. And slavery is abolished in the territories. Now, those are areas where Congress can act, the president can act. They don't have to push for a law. They can just kind of move very quickly in that. In July of 1862, they passed that Confiscation Act. Congress established diplomatic missions with Haiti and with Liberia, both of which were black nations. Haiti, you remember the Haitian Revolution had occurred. Haiti was the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere. Haiti was the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere. Excuse me. And Liberia is a black republic in Africa. So he's got to figure out what is he going to do. The State Department issues a passport to Henry Highland Garnett, designating him as a citizen of the United States. And then finally, in September of 1862, Lincoln has his victory, and he can now issue the Emancipation Proclamation. The preliminary proclamation is issued in September of 1862. And if you'll just turn very quickly to the appendix of your textbook, Appendix 13, and you'll see the actual proclamation itself. Now, as you read through the proclamation, I want you to look at this document, first of all, as a war document. It is issued as what Lincoln calls a fit and necessary measure to end an armed rebellion against the United States. So Lincoln, in effect, is changing the nature of the war from a war to restore a union that was already falling apart and could not be brought back together, to a crusade to end slavery. Why is he doing this? Well, in many ways, he's doing this to draw support from Northern abolitionists, from sympathetic Northerners, people who cannot see this effectively as a war that can end, that can bring the Union back together. That's something that's beyond the scope of what they can believe in. But to turn this into a war that is in effect a crusade to end slavery makes it a different kind of conflict. It is also a diplomatic measure because Lincoln is trying to make sure that there is no formal recognition of the Confederate States of America. You remember I said that in the Eastern Theater, east of the Appalachian Mountains, the Confederates are having some very significant victories. It appears that they are winning the war. So Lincoln, in effect, let me back up. In effect, England and France are already giving aid and assistance to the Union Army, to the Confederate Army, but they have not recognized the Confederate States as a separate nation. By issuing this Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln has made it impossible for these nations to formally recognize the slaveholding section of the slaveholding nation. He is saying, in effect, to the laboring classes in England and France that we are a different kind of republic in the Union from that slaveholding republic or whatever in the South. This is also a humanitarian document because it does give hope to millions of African Americans, although it does not fully do what it seems to do. So we have to kind of take a look at this and ask, if this is an Emancipation Proclamation, who is actually freed? And that's a very important question for you to look at as you look through the document. In the Emancipation Proclamation, you have at the very beginning of it a statement that refers to this preliminary document that Lincoln had issued in September of 1862, saying in effect that on January 1st of 1863, he will now declare that all slaves in states that are still in rebellion against the Union are now free. All right. He also lists the areas specifically where this document will apply and where it will not apply. So you've got, for example, the exceptions of those counties in Western Virginia that are in effect West Virginia now, and they are petitioning to come into the Union as a separate state. You've got those parishes that he mentions in Louisiana along the Mississippi River. Those are accepted. He considers them to be accepted because those are areas that have already been recaptured by the Union Army. And you'll notice as you look through this document that Tennessee is not mentioned. It is not in the list of states that he lists as whole states that are still in rebellion. It's not in those areas that he says, he doesn't describe it as an accepted area. It's not mentioned at all. So in effect, we come back to the question, what does this document accomplish? Who is really freed? All right. He is freeing slaves in states that are still in rebellion. In effect, in areas or states that are part of the Confederate States of America. He is not freeing slaves in the border states like Missouri, Kentucky. He is not freeing slaves in the state of Tennessee. Right? And the big question here is, why not Tennessee? Right? So I'll leave that to you to try to go and do a little research as to why not Tennessee. What this also does, what the document also does, is to, in one of those, one of the paragraphs a little further down, he says that he is going to allow Black men who are fit and healthy and able to enlist in the Union Army. So he's opening up this whole new category, this possibility of potential soldiers who can aid and assist in the rebellion. But at the same time, there is also this possibility that, if the slaves who are in the South and the Confederate States hear about this, there's the potential for rebellion, for slave rebellion. Lincoln cautions against this, and he basically tells the former slaves, or any slaves who might hear about this, he tells them, don't do this. Let's just kind of take this very slow. We'll kind of move through this whole process. So he doesn't want to seem to be encouraging a slave rebellion. He does welcome Black troops into the Union Army. He does encourage, he kind of is pushing toward rebellion, toward an end to the war. And even though he's not encouraging a rebellion, you might say that he's maybe trying to strike a little fear in the minds of Southerners, slaveholding and non-slaveholding Southerners, who might be very fearful and might start thinking, well, what will happen if the slaves hear about Lincoln's order? Will they take this as an assurance that if they fight for the Union, if they institute a rebellion, if they leave the plantations, all of these things are things that Lincoln is subtly trying to encourage slaves to do without really saying this. Now, in the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about the impact of this Emancipation Proclamation in terms of Lincoln's statement that he will welcome African Americans, freedmen, or free blacks, civil antebellum or pre-Civil War free blacks, that he's going to welcome them into the Union Army. So we'll see what happens as this Emancipation Proclamation takes effect.